Amber, Terri, thank you both so much for joining us. This is such a fun episode for us to do. To start off here, why don't you guys just tell us a little bit about who you each are and your podcast as well.
I'll go first. Tanse, ay bigasis ni Tigason, Tinakomasik Otsinia. My name is Amber Dion, and I'm from the Kihiwin Cree Nation here in Treaty 6 territory. And I'm an assistant professor with MacEwan University School of Social Work. I'm a parent. I'm a lot of things. I'm a lover. and I'll allow my co-host here to introduce herself.
My name is Terri Cardinal. I'm from Sadly Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory. I am the co-creator, co-producer of Two Crees in a Pod with Amber. I am currently the Director of Indigenous Initiatives with MacEwan University. I'm a PhD student in social work, and I'm also working in my home community with the Indian Residential School Project. And I'm a mom.
Well, the mom, I think, is one of the most important things that you just listed there. So, Two Crees in a Pod, I mean, a great name, first of all. Can you share a little bit of like, the story of the podcast?
For sure. It was one of my bright ideas. And it was about 1 o'clock in the morning on a weekday. I couldn't sleep. And I had messaged my best friend here, Terri, at that time, and I said, hey, do you want to start a podcast? And she, I don't know why she agreed, but she did. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, so maybe we were both a little tired, but the reason why we started the podcast in the first place was to ensure that there was some auditory resources specifically for social work students at that time. And we wanted to ensure that that our stories were being told by us. As you know, our stories get told with or without us. And so we wanted to ensure that we were the ones holding the space and inviting other people in to share our stories. At that time, it was more directed towards social work education, and it has morphed and grown so much since then. And we now talk to all kinds of folks about all kinds of things Indigenous. And so the name Two Crees in a Pod, again, her and I were talking about what we would name it, and then we came up with Two Crees in a Pod.
I still think that's one of the better names out there for a podcast, so you guys did well there. And one of the things that you guys talk about quite a bit, and you space it out, but you do talk about it, is Indigenous love, and you bring it up on your podcast. I just wanted to ask about that, and maybe what you guys have learned talking about it, talking to different people about Indigenous love, and what you've learned, and maybe try to pass on to each other as well.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because when we did our first podcast with our auntie, Dr. Leona McCocus, the conversation in that first podcast talked about love. And then when we were done that season, the last interview that we did, they also talked about love. And so, Amber and I have had these conversations and how love really encompasses a lot of things, whether that be our intimate partner relationships, whether that be our relationships with our friends, our family, our relationships with ceremony, our relationships with the land, and so really how that comes to be. And I was just telling Amber, as I even dive into my research, and I'm really understanding and researching many different areas around research on the land, for instance, is understanding our relationship and our love for the land. And I was once asked, do you love the land? And I'm like, yeah, I love the land. But why do you love the land? What is it that you love about the land? And I had to really think about that in that relationship that I have to the land. And I think that, part of this, when we've done this work, love is always very present in our podcasts. And I think that, we had the session that we did with Amber, and that was actually a session on Indigenous love, which we did, I think, in 2020 or 2021. And that was done in a parking lot in her vehicle, where it was a spur of a moment kind of podcast where she called and she's like, I need to talk and we need to record this. And I was like, all right. So she picked me up and we got into the car, found a parking lot, grabbed some tea, sat in there and did this podcast on Indigenous love. And really part of that was just, I think, Amber and I just processing some of the challenges that we've experienced in our relationships as Indigenous women. Because it looks differently. Even when we think about learning about love or learning about different attachment styles within our own life, we learn about them in the Western perspective, but how we experience them as Indigenous people is very different. It is very different. And so we're always having these interesting conversations.
Well, yeah. Amber, did you want to add on to that?
I think the only thing, Terri did a really great job of describing, all of those things. I think that I remember one of the first times I wrote about love, and we'll do a shameless plug here as well, that there's also a meditation album that was released that we are launching on February 14th. And the album is called Kisagitin, which means love in the Cree language. And I remember many years ago, it was probably about 11 years ago, that I had my very first experience with writing about love. And it was in relation to my dad. And I remember sitting in my office. I was teaching at a different institution at that time. And I had to ask myself, how do I know I was loved? And because the language of love wasn't used in my home. And it's not because my parents didn't love us and they don't love us. It's because they didn't have the language of love. They couldn't say, I love you. And so I started writing about it way back then. And I had to start asking myself, how did I know I was loved, by an Indian residential school survivor? How did I know I was loved? And so I started to write down all the ways that I knew, all the indicators of Indigenous love. And so recently, Terri and her team were involved in developing this meditation album. It's a second volume, actually. And I wrote out this piece. My dad passed away in May, almost 2 years ago. And I wrote this piece for my dad. And it was about ensuring that my dad knew that I knew he loved me. And so I wrote it out, and Terri spoke it onto the album, and her dad responded. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful piece. It's track number 3 on that album. And it's a beautiful piece that's dedicated to our fathers, and who are both Indian residential school survivors. And so this discussion of love for me began, with understanding what that means from a father-daughter relationship, and then eventually turned into a lot of other things for me about understanding intimate partner relationships, specifically Indigenous intimate partner relationships.
Well, what you both said is just so heartwarming and so refreshing to hear, in a sense. And I know it's one of the things that you both had talked about. Again, I've listened to your podcast. It's great. I did listen to the car episode in the parking lot, and I thought that was one of the best episodes. But one of the things that the two of you talk about is being there for each other and giving each other love, both and encouraging good ways, but also the tough love, I think, is also just as important. Would you guys agree with that? And then maybe why tough love is also important in any relationship you have?
The way that her and I smarten each other up, we definitely smarten one another up, and it is that, and Terri talked earlier about ceremony. And, one of the things that I've learned in my life, in both being in ceremony and also witnessing other people in ceremony, is we're sometimes, a lot of the time, we're given very direct, I don't know, maybe it's a bit strict sometimes, or maybe folks, feel like it's strict, but we're told how to behave, in those spaces. And Terri and I do that with one another. We remind each other of both our gifts and all the ways that we are good in this world. And then we have to smarten one another up sometimes, much like we would get it from a grandmother, a grandmother saying, hey, that's enough, smarten up, And so I think that that's one of the ways that we show love to one another, for sure.
And I'll add to that because I think that like this speaks to the importance of having those type of solid relationships in our lives. The importance of how that actually creates a lot of balance within ourselves, but also those healthy relationships when we have the supports in place that could help us through trauma or through losses. Because we're all human beings and we're all going to experience trauma and we're all going to experience losses, especially as we get older. And I think that when we have that healthy connection or relationship with somebody close in our lives, and they are able to be in that space and love us when we experience trauma and loss, that helps us move through trauma and loss. When it's unresolved, it's when we've experienced a trauma or a loss where we haven't had that, or our partner hasn't given us that. And so, working through that, and I think that, Amber and I have known each other a very long time. And I've gone through some stuff as well as she has. And we've always been there to support each other, to assist one another and to hold space for one another, and loving space for one another.
Well, so many people have so many different paths, but at the same time, it seems like we all have a lot of similar stories. And to hear some of what you're saying, I'm sure many, many people can also relate to that, which is so heartwarming to hear. And obviously, we're here talking about love, and we can't let you go without asking the two of you some of your favorite things and what you guys love. What do you guys love?
That's a big question. There's the obvious, the relationships that we have in our lives, our children, our families, our sisterhoods that we have. And I think that part of that has to do with how do we, and Terri and I have talked about this on, some informal conversations, but also on our podcast about expressing how we experience one another, and that how we experience one another is through love, and how we share that throughout the world. So I think about what I love myself, at first and foremost, and that's something I've learned a lot of over the last year and a half, is about how to love myself and how to share that love and be that light that some folks might need a little bit more of. They can't take too much, though. They can't take too much of the light. But really, I think about how there's the obvious things, but there's also that importance about how do we love ourselves? What are the things that we're saying to ourselves? And that's something I've had a big learning about.
And Terri, what do you love?
Yeah, and adding to that, of course, our relationships that we have in our life, our children, our families, our community. I think that, the immediate thought, and I think about gratitude right away, and in that same sense, the love that I have with Creator, and the love that I have to that spiritual connection to my grandmothers and my grandfathers. I think that that's one of the strongest. When I think and I have my meditations, or I'm smudging in the morning, I am showing that gratitude. But there's almost like this gratitude of like, oh, thank you for loving me, and thank you for protecting me, and thank you for taking care of not just me but my family, and that reciprocal understanding of that love for the spiritual world. I think that that's definitely something that we sometimes forget. And it's such a powerful way to be in relation and to start your day. And I think that the important piece of that what Terri just said is that you are love. I am love. You are love. We are all love. And that's our first teaching. That is our very first teaching in many Indigenous cultures globally. The first teaching is always love. And so, we are born into this world to experience it, and we are born into this world to offer it to others as well. And so, I love you. Here you go.
Here you go. Here's the love.
I think that's such a great reminder because some people can tend to forget that, especially in some of the harder times. So I'm really glad you guys said that. That's really such an important thing to remember. And I wish we had more time, guys. We could talk about this for so long. Maybe we'll have to make a whole podcast episode about this. But thank you guys so much for coming on InFocus. We really enjoyed this, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.